Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you will have some knowledge or some grasp on why we conduct policing, or I should say community policing, today. We'll talk more about the eras of policing as we go through, but for right now, what I want you to know is that there are three major eras of policing that we're going to be talking about. One is the political era of policing, two is the professional or reform era of policing, and three is the community policing era. The ability to understand this history and how we've developed as a nation in terms of policing will help us to understand why we now conduct community policing. So understanding where we came from and how we developed are very important to understanding where we're going in the future and how to best conduct policing. Okay, so let's talk about Rome really quick. You know, one of the first democracies, and there was policing going on in Rome, and there's some terminology that came out of Roman society that is still used today. So your book talks about this more in detail, but if you look at that word there, the vigiles or vigils, I don't even know how to pronounce it, and I apologize, I should. First were firefighters, and then later developed police responsibilities. Now, this is important because we're going to look into early policing in England, and we're going to see some of the same concepts being applied, but then more formally developed into a formal policing system. And if you look at that root word vigiles, it's the root of vigilance, it's the root of vigilante, which is a word that is still used if you think about the Minutemen who do their thing down on the Mexican border in the southern part of the United States and places like that. We still use that term vigilante. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, basically on the European continent there was anarchy. There was no formalized government structure that was able to control things and keep society in check. During the 12th and 13th centuries in England, we started to see laws enforced by kings. We saw the development of something called the Night Watch, and we saw France start using mounted military patrols to go out and enforce civil law. The Night Watch is something we'll talk about more as we go through this lecture here, which I will want you to remember and understand. So we talked about community policing a moment ago, but community policing is just our latest form of policing. We have done a number of different forms of policing as a human civilization over the last 500-600 years. If you look back at kin policing, each member of the clan had some authority to enforce rules and carry out punishments. It could be caning, it could be stoning, it could be something like that. But everybody had authority and obligation to carry out punishments. We'll talk more about that, where everybody has a responsibility. Rome, we've talked about Rome a little bit already. So let's look at the mutual pledge system, because this really started to be the first formal type of policing system in England, which is important because this got carried over into the United States and into America later. But we mentioned the Night Watch earlier, and the Night Watch was simply when somebody would walk around at night and make sure that there was nothing catching on fire. So if you think back to the vigiles in Rome, they started out as firefighters, because really, what were your biggest dangers back then? Things catching on fire and bad guys doing bad things. Well, the Night Watch was simply somebody stayed up all night and walked around and made sure that there was nobody invading the township or the city, that the walls and the gates were secure, the street lamps were lit, and that nothing was catching on fire. Along came the mutual pledge system, and this was a system that was developed in England, and it was just simply a system for keeping order. And every male age 15 and older was required to help maintain order, and this is where the term posse comitatus comes from, a group called pursue fleeing felons. We still have this term. There's still several sheriff's posses in existence throughout the West. This system consisted of tithings, hundreds or parishes, and several hundreds or shires. 10 families was one tithing, 100 tithings was 100 or one parish, and several hundreds was a shire. basically the equivalent to a county. Now, during this time in feudal England, the kings started appointing shire reeves, which became the term sheriff, which obviously we still use in the United States. This term goes well back to the Middle Ages in England. The shire, the mutual pledge, frank pledge system, we talked about that already. So, the key here, in the mutual pledge system, if a tithing man or if a member of the community age 15 or older, remember, who had the obligation of helping to enforce these rules and laws, if they saw a crime happening, they were to let out a hue and a cry. That's the terminology they used back then for basically saying, hey, everybody come help, something bad is happening. In an agrarian society, this worked very well. Now, we're not going to get too deep into the terminology of informal social control in this lecture, but be that as it may, there is a dynamic among communities called informal social control, where society tends to control itself without the need for formalized policing services. This works well in agrarian societies where people are very homogeneous and very closely knit with strong community ties. 13th century England. The Statute of Winchester was passed in 1285. This replaced the tithing system with the watch and ward. This established the position and title of constable. This is the person who supervised the watchers. This law required individuals to keep and bear arms. Now, this is interesting because everybody in the society was required to be armed, and you wonder, could this ever happen today? If you click on this link here, in Greenleaf, Idaho, in 2006, this actually did happen, where the mayor and city council passed a law requiring all citizens to be armed. Let me pull up this article for you here really quick. So if you read this article, and I'll scroll through it slowly, you can pause the video if you want to read the whole thing and catch this. But in 2006, that by ordinance, the City Council of Greenleaf, Idaho, just over out of Caldwell, they passed an ordinance requiring citizens who did not have one of the exceptions listed in the law to possess a firearm for civil defense and for civil order. So, interesting that this could still happen today. I think a knee-jerk reaction would be no, this couldn't happen today, but definitely it still can. Illegal to not assist the watchman. So during or under the Statute of Winchester, if you did not assist the watchman when they let out the hue and the cry, you could be charged with a crime. Well, could that ever happen today? Well, let's look at an Idaho state law really quick. Title 18, Chapter 7, Section 707, refusing assistance to officers. Now read this carefully. Every male person above the age of 18 years of age who neglects or refuses to join the posse comitatus or power of the county by neglecting or refusing to aid and assist in taking or arresting any person against whom there may be issued any process, or by neglecting to aid and assist in retaking any person who, after being arrested or confined, may have escaped from such arrest or imprisonment, or by neglecting or refusing to aid and assist in preventing any breach of the peace or in the commission of any criminal offense, being thereto lawfully required by any sheriff, deputy sheriff, coroner, constable, judge, or other officer concerned in the administration of justice, is punishable by a fine of not less than $50 and not more than $1,000. So, does this have reflections of what was going on in England in 1200? Well, yes, it does. The term posse comitatus is there. Okay, the age limit. Back then it was age 15 or older. Now it's age 18 or older. If you refuse to assist law enforcement in conducting their duties, it's a punishable offense. So interesting how history ties into what we do in present day. Okay, so the watch and ward. This is probably the most rudimentary form of metropolitan policing in its infancy or in its beginning stages. The responsibilities of the watchman: patrolling the streets from dusk to dawn, keeping people indoors, keeping them quiet, not allowing strangers to come into the city or roam around, lighting lamps, putting out fires, clearing garbage, and enforcing criminal laws. Sorry about that, I'll go back. Other developments during this time, the term justice of the peace. This was in non-urban areas. Then there was an urban justice of the peace. The duties of the constables broadened. We still use that term in the United States. And urbanism, we started seeing a move from agrarian societies into more urban societies with industrialization taking place in England. By the end of the 1700s in England, populations had shifted to urban areas, and new supplemental forms of policing were being created. And the reason this was happening is because the issues that people faced in agrarian societies were much different than the issues people started to see in urban societies, with more social issues, with poverty, begging, more persons crimes, theft, and things like that taking place in urban societies with higher population densities. So some supplemental forms of policing were developed. Private police and bodyguards for people with money. Thief takers or thief catchers. These were people who were paid by the king to go out and track down stolen merchandise and get that stolen merchandise back for the victims or the people who had it taken from them. So we talk about here, what are the ramifications of this type of system? What's the worst consequence of a thief getting caught? That type of thing. Well, what do you think? Well, some of the ramifications, if you think about private police and bodyguards, well, who could afford private police and bodyguards? Well, we still have that today, right? There's a company called Gavin de Becker and Associates, which basically does threat assessment and private policing and bodyguarding for very wealthy people. We'll talk about them later in the semester when we talk about different job possibilities. Well, you've got to have money to be able to afford them. So there was an unequal protection for people in England during this time, because people with money were able to pay for private police and bodyguards. The thief takers, thief catchers, they were inherently corrupt. They might facilitate the thefts themselves just to go recover the merchandise and make some money off of it. They might put it up for the highest bidder when they caught one of the burglars who had taken property. If they paid them off more than they were going to get from capturing them, then they might let that person go. So it was inherently corrupt, and it wasn't a good way of protecting the public or enforcing the law. As a result of some of these practices, writings from people like Patrick Colquhoun and other people started to develop during this time, saying that we need more effective policing in England. So in the early 19th century, or the early 1800s, the British Home Secretary in England was Sir Robert Peel. Now, this is probably the most important historical figure in all of policing history, at least modern policing history. In 1822, he was writing and criticizing policing practices in London. In 1829, he was able to author and get passed unanimously the Metropolitan Police Act. This created the first organized British Metropolitan Police Force, and it created a model for modern-day policing like we see it today. If you go to page 6 in your text, Robert Peel's 9 principles of policing are listed there. I would do that, as you will likely be quizzed on those principles there. And they're very important for understanding how policing developed and why it developed in the way it did. So the Metropolitan Police Force was developed with a military structure, but the people in Britain were resistant to this. They were worried about giving up so much freedom to their government by allowing a police force that was going to come in and constantly be in the area enforcing laws. So what they did is they did a couple fundamental things. They sold this concept to the people of England as the police force being protectors of your freedoms, not restrictors of your freedoms, and basically said, look, crime is bad enough that you are losing freedom to criminal type people. The police are going to come in and not just protect your rights, but they're also going to keep these other people from infringing upon them. Also, they took the uniforms, the British military uniform, which was red, and they made the bobbies uniform, or the police uniforms, blue, to distinguish them from the military, to say, hey, look, these are not military people. They had a testing process where they could hire the most competent personnel possible, and strict hiring and behavioral standards is a way of giving comfort to the citizens of England that they weren't going to be out running roughshod over them and violating their rights. The emphasis was on crime prevention. Sir Robert Peel, as you go through his principles, you'll see that he thought it was very much more important to prevent crime from happening than it was to detect and to fight crime. Police officers were distributed throughout the city. He was going for high visibility of police officers to deter crime from happening, and developed a beat system, which is something we still use today, but now today it's generally in patrol cars, but it was where a police officer had a designated area that they were supposed to walk through and be visibly present and be available to provide assistance to the citizens. The goals were to prevent crime, maintain public order, reduce conflict, and to demonstrate police efficiency. Now, at this time in England's history, they were under a political philosophy of utilitarianism, which was they needed to be very cost efficient. For every dollar they put in, they needed to get the same dollar's worth of value back out or better. So part of selling a full-on public police force to the people of England was to promise them that they would be very efficient. We will see how efficiency can come back to be a negative in police work as we go through this chapter. Okay, so now let's switch over and let's look at America. Even prior to the Metropolitan Police Act, let's look at some regional differences in policing in the 1600s and the 1700s in America. In the Northeast, they were working very similar to England with a night watch system. In the South, policing was based almost exclusively on slave patrols, recovering runaway slaves. And in the West, with big, broad areas, in the West back then, if you think about it, in the 1600s and the 1700s would be like Ohio and Kentucky. In those areas, they had sheriffs and marshals to patrol those large areas. So very, very little law enforcement and more of a need for self-imposed law enforcement by communities. Some traditions from England that came to America: justice of the peace, the sheriff, the constable, the night watch. Okay, now we're going to break into some eras of policing in the United States. And like I said, there's three. There's the political era, there's the professional or the reform era, and then there is the community policing era. And the first of these is the political era of policing. These dates are not written in stone. These are general guidelines, but from about 1840 to 1920 is what we consider the political era of policing to do. We had modern police forces during this time. As you saw in my introduction video, I held up the challenge coin from the City of Boston Police Department, where they say they're the first police department in the nation. At the same time, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia were developing police forces. During the political era, there was a large, heavy influence of politics in every aspect of policing. Thus, we call it the political era. Police forces were administered by elected police commissions. This had some significant ramifications on consistency in policing, as well as equality in enforcement of laws and the implementation of justice. There was a lot of political and economic corruption throughout the entire United States at this time, not just in policing, but of course it was in policing as well. Police officers have and use discretion widely, which is their ability to make decisions, their ability to look at, say, a law that's been violated and choose not to take any enforcement action because the better course of action is to give a warning or something of that nature. When politics got infused into policing, the one thing they could do to get favor with certain voting groups was to abuse discretion and use discretion to give favors to people who might support them or politically support them. So just like today, if a police officer were to pull over a friend who was driving drunk and instead of arresting them for DUI, give them a ride home and use their discretion in that manner, discretion was being abused for political gains during this time. Another thing that was going on, and if you remember that police departments were being run by elected commissions, is something called patronage. Politicians were promising jobs to people in exchange for political support. So if they got elected into an office, they would gut the police department of those people who did not support them, and they would infuse people into the police department who they'd promised jobs to. Because during this time, police work paid relatively well. It was consistent and secure employment, where people didn't have to worry about losing their jobs, at least until the next election cycle, and they were sought after positions. So constantly we had very high turnover in policing, with new police officers every election cycle, and we never developed the expertise or the really seasoned police officer who knew how to do the job and was able to pass along that knowledge to younger police officers. This created a poorly run and corrupt policing system during the political era. So selection of police officers, it was not done based on any criteria other than who supported who in an election, and discretion was being abused. At the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, policing in the United States was nothing like Robert Peel's vision. And I encourage you to go back and look at those 9 principles, and policing in the United States was not like that. Police were corrupt, they were brutal, and they were inefficient. Something had to dramatically change, and this call for change was going on throughout the United States as well, in all aspects of government. In 1919, all Boston police officers went on strike, and it was quickly realized that something had to be done about this, because when the police went on strike, civil order went away. Anarchy and looting prevailed. So the option was to either kind of give police officers whatever they wanted if they chose to strike to keep them from striking, or to treat them harshly to keep them from striking in the future. Well, option B was chosen, and the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, fired all the police officers who went on strike and replaced them, and thus it's been illegal for police officers to go on strike since that time. So during the same time is when Prohibition was passed in the United States, which is the only constitutional amendment that's ever been repealed. It made alcohol illegal to sell and manufacture, and of course led to a rise in organized crime because the demand for alcohol was so high. What started to happen at this point in time was local departments were having a very difficult time enforcing laws effectively, especially with bootlegging and things crossing state lines and that type of activity. So you started to see a rise in federal law enforcement in our country as well. Okay, so what started to happen around 1920 and during this era was there was so much corruption in government in the United States that there was calls for reformation throughout government. Policing was just one aspect of this. This led us into a new era of policing in the United States, which we refer to as the professional era or the reform era, where the legalistic model of policing was implemented. Now, my opinion is that this is the most important era of policing development in the United States history. Not to diminish from any other, but I believe this to be one of the most important. This was an attempt to improve police behavior and performance, and it runs roughly from 1920 through 1960, maybe 1970, maybe even 1980, depending on how you look at it. Again, those dates are not set in stone. During this time, and you can see in this Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, which we still use today, all the different attempts to reform police officers, who they were, and whether or not they were corrupt. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. I do want to tell you that before I could graduate the police academy in 1996 in California, I had to be able to recite this from memory. And if I could not, I could not graduate the police academy. But I encourage you to read this and to see how they describe the ideal police officer and what they want the image of a police officer to be, and what they want individual police officers to strive to be. Okay, let me go back. Also during this time, we entered into the Great Depression. Now this is pretty important in terms of the history of policing in the United States for a couple of reasons. One is we started to see more educated people going into law enforcement, because people with greater levels of education, all of a sudden their availability for jobs was drying up, whether it be in banking, investing, those types of things. Those jobs are going away, and people were looking at policing jobs as jobs with a high level of security, and that those jobs were likely not to go away, with decent pay, and they could do something good for society. And we started to see an influx of more educated people into the policing profession. Also, what happened during the Great Depression is we were striving to save money and to be very cost efficient. This decreased opposition to centralization. So what this means is, prior to this time, the policing model in the United States was to have several substations or precincts spread out among a community, and to work locally within those sectors of the community. During the Great Depression, in an effort to be efficient, they abandoned that concept and became highly centralized with one place where all the police officers were housed. This becomes important later because it helps to start creating a dynamic of where the police don't feel like members of the public or members of the community. They feel like an us versus them type of situation, where there are police officers have their own subculture and they don't identify with the communities they're serving. Some reaction to the political era? Well, this was found in how we conducted policing in the professional era. Police community relationships were weakened. One of the places where police community relationships were looked at as corrupt was during the political era, when, say, you had immigrants who were police officers. They would use discretion to favor their different immigrant groups. They pulled away from this during the professional era, and they weakened those relationships between the police and the community because they thought that was encouraging corruption. Also, advocates of professional policing believed in crime fighting. Now remember, Robert Peel and the Metropolitan Police Act, their number one goal was to prevent crime. Crime fighting is the opposite of that. That is catching bad guys, identifying the crimes, and becoming very, very good at going out and catching the bad guys, developing evidence, developing cases, coming up with tactics. And we did during the during the professional era of policing, we did become very good at crime fighting. Also during this time, the advent of scientific policing, or the Bertillon system. This was a rational and detached form of policing. Just the facts, black and white, what science say. This provided a curriculum for training for police officers so we could have a minimum standard, a baseline level of knowledge and ability that each police officer would have. It also developed things like the use of fingerprints, the use of mugshots, the use of physical descriptions and clothing descriptions, and MOs, or modus operandi, to understand how criminals worked. We got better at catching bad guys. There were some negative sides of the legalistic model. One is that detachment of the police from the community. 2 is the desire for efficiency. 3, tension between immigrant groups and police. And 4, multiple riots. So let's talk about those for a second. So the detachment of police from the community. Well, if police officers don't feel like they're a member of the community, if they feel like they're just there to control that community, then their empathy levels go down. And if they're trying to be efficient, then they have to figure out how are they going to define what efficiency looks like for a police officer. Well, the way that got defined was an efficient police officer was the officer who was making the most arrests, the arrests for the most significant crimes, and the police officer who was writing the most tickets. Well, if a police officer is solely focused on making arrests, following the letter of the law, writing tickets, that harms that relationship with the community even more. In addition, where could police officers go to write more tickets, to make more arrests? Well, they could go to low socioeconomic areas. Low socioeconomic areas tend to be areas that are easier to find infractions and criminal offenses. Now, it's not to say that in higher socioeconomic areas there's not criminal activity taking place, but it's certainly more difficult to find it and enforce the law. Think of making a traffic stop. If a police officer was following two cars down the freeway, they're both going the speed limit, and one is a 2014 brand new Mercedes SL 700, and the other is a 1974 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme that is about ready to fall off of its wheels, which of those two vehicles is going to be easier for the police officer to stop? Well, it's going to be the old bucket of bolts with all sorts of violations all over it. And generally, you'll see somebody from a higher socioeconomic class driving the Mercedes and somebody from a lower socioeconomic class driving the Oldsmobile. Thus, the people in lower socioeconomic classes tend to feel targeted. Well, generally, especially during the early part of the 1900s, people in the lowest socioeconomic classes were those people who had just immigrated into the United States. Thus, tensions rose. This culminated in the 1960s and also in the early 1900s with multiple riots, based partially, if not significantly, on the manner in which police officers were conducting themselves and enforcing the laws. Some recommendations of the professional era: efficiency and emphasis on substantive laws. There's two types of laws. There are substantive laws and there are procedural laws. Procedural laws are things like Miranda versus Arizona, which we'll talk about more later in the semester, that tells us how to conduct things. It tells police officers what they must do if they want to interview somebody about a crime. Substantive laws are the laws that restrict your behavior. Tell you not to speed, tell you not to drive with a blood alcohol level greater than 0.08, tell you not to rob people of their possessions, tell you not to be drunk in public. With an emphasis on substantive laws and not community issues and preventing crime and solving problems, people of all walks of life were feeling enforcement action from police departments. Technological developments. Well, as technology improved, the need and the ability to interact with our communities went down. I'll give you one example. Air conditioning in patrol cars. What happened when we got air conditioning in patrol cars? Well, the windows went up to keep the hot air out and the cold air in. And what did that do for our ability to hear what's going on the street? Our ability to talk to somebody at a stoplight, at a stop sign. Just cars in general, what did that do to our ability to connect with our communities? Well, it diminished it because police officers were now expected to patrol a much larger area and they were in police cars. Thus, there was a barrier between them and the communities they were serving, and so informal contact, like saying, "Hi, how's it going today, officer?" went down, and now police officers were having predominantly only formal contact with people of the community, which was generally enforcement action. Promotions based on merit? Well, that's not necessarily bad, but what was merit defined as? Merit was defined as efficiency. And if you started promoting the most efficient officers, they were going to start rewarding officers who were more efficient. And if efficiency was defined as making arrests, writing tickets, you got more and more and more of that. So in the 1960s, the beginning of the end of the professional era came about. The dynamics in America were changing very significantly in the 1960s between the assassination of a president, between the Vietnam War, between civil rights movement, between women's rights movements. There was a lot changing that culminated in more riots and more protests towards the end of that decade. Ultimately, the tactics that were used by the police came into question, and crime commissions were formed to look into why there was so much civil unrest in the United States and how police practices and tactics were influencing that or helping to affect that. This created a challenge to the legalistic model of policing, and it gradually started to change how we conducted policing in the United States. In addition, critics of policing in the United States started to look at the whole purpose for police officers, and that was to prevent crime. And we had become very efficient. We had become very tactical. We had become well educated and very knowledgeable about catching criminals. But even with all of that, crime continued to go up. And with crime going up, policing, or at least the protectors of that model of policing and that form of conducting policing, really did not have an argument to fall back on, because there was nothing they could say with crime still going up. Even with their ability to catch criminals, we still appeared to be inefficient because crime kept going up. And if you look here at just the rest of these questions on the screen, what happens to the populations in jails and prisons when we get more and more efficient? Well, those populations go up and up and up. Taxpayers could not afford to keep supporting increases in prison numbers, in prison populations, and prison sizes, and thus less and less criminals were being incarcerated. So it didn't matter how many we arrested, crime continued to rise. Okay, well, sorry about that. So that is all I've got for you this week. That's just a quick look at the history of policing in the United States. I did not touch too much on community policing or the attacks of September 11th, and the reason I did not do that is because we're going to touch on those extensively as we go through the semester. But I just wanted you to have just a very brief look at history and how that's influenced policing in the United States, and I will be referring back to this for the rest of the semester constantly.